Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Second International Conference on Education 2022 with the theme Adaptive Education, Empowering Quality Education Through Teaching and Learning. So we are going to proceed to the next speaker for today. Allow me to invite Professor John Adamson, from University of Niigata Prefecture, Japan, with a topic of presentation, English for Academic Purposes, Current Trends. To you, Prof.
Hello there. Thank you for inviting me. I'll just share my screen with you so we can start. Okay, so can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay, so I'd like to talk to you today about English for academic purposes. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for coming, first of all. As you can see, my title is English for Academic Purposes, Current Trends, and I hope it will be relevant to both teachers and researchers in this field. Just as a short introduction to today's talk, let's consider a few background facts and considerations. You see, firstly, worldwide, people have been studying in a foreign language for many years, meaning that they study content, a subject, in another language. And this trend is actually spreading. Secondly, we can see this in a sense as globalization. We're familiar with that word, but it's not just the typical study abroad, experience. It can also mean in many Asian settings, EMI at home. However, for some universities in Asia, this internationalization may mean English medium instruction or actually L1 medium instruction in their own country. Their own country's L1, for example, in my context, internationalization may mean, foreign students coming to Japan, studying with Japanese in Japanese, yeah? But in many cases, when we're talking about EMI, English medium instruction, we've got to look at the objectives of exploring English for academic purposes and the trends about it. And I think the trends are pretty much kind of, as I've listed here, the idea of preparation for EMI through EAP. So EAP has the purpose of preparing students for future or concurrent EMI, English medium instruction. Now, today's themes then are going to be EMI, EAP, CLIL, which is Content and Language Integrated Learning, and something called translanguaging. So I'm sorry, there are a few sort of terms that we just have to become a little bit familiar with today. The first slide here, it kind of contextualizes what I'm talking about today worldwide. Now, this slide shows a map of how people are studying in other languages around the world. Notice that I mean in other languages. Not studying languages. Now, a map showing how people study other languages means language classes. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about that directly today. This map here is about how people study content in other languages around the world. And look at the map here. Say, for example, over on the top left, in Canada, North America, French immersion in public schools. Look in the Middle East or the American universities which are active there. All around the world, people are either traveling to study EMI or they are in their own country studying EMI. Let's just look at EMI then for just a few minutes and think about it in relation to where I am in Japan. Now, the idea of long-term studying abroad for Japanese students has been actually in decline due to various reasons for a long time. For example, job hunting, so they don't want to study abroad. The fees are very high to study abroad. They may have to miss a year and, study 5 years where their friends study only 4 years. So the idea of studying in English in Japan, not studying abroad, is actually becoming more and more popular. Now, MEXT is the Ministry of Education over here in Japan. They've launched programs to encourage the elite universities, no, not my university, by the way, to become more global or international, with the results that universities teach home, I mean Japanese students, and foreign students in L2 English, and sometimes in Japanese, as I mentioned before. Now, generally, Japanese university global rankings have been a little poor, to be honest with you. So this idea of, globalization and EMI is kind of a way to catch up and improve ranking. So who's doing it in Japan? Now, we all hear of famous Japanese universities. Now, about the current state is that about 46% of universities offer some kind of EMI, not usually full programs, but usually 1 or 2 courses within a Japanese curriculum. Now, non-elite universities like mine see this as a chance to keep up their profile and have a competitive edge in the market for both home and foreign students. But let's just think a little bit about this in the practical sense. What do Japanese teachers who are asked to teach EMI actually need? Well, we did some research into my own university, and we asked the Japanese teachers, and we found that these Japanese teachers for economics, politics, environment, and comparative culture, they wanted students to develop a bilingual literacy, meaning the ability to include L1, Japanese resources, and ways of studying. The second thing we found was that the content teachers stressed that they did not want to try to replicate EMI as if it were a Western campus, like in London or New York or somewhere in Australia. No. They wanted the idea of EMI here in Japan. So the third thing is that they wanted a localized form of EMI and delivery, which made use of Japanese and English like like bilingualism. Now, we've got to remember here, other universities may have strict monolingual policies, i.e. English only in EMI. But what is actually happening over here in Japan is a kind of a hybridity. What we're seeing happening is the E in EMI being challenged by including Japanese as well as a mixture. Now, in response to our study in our own university, we considered then how English classes, English for academic purposes classes, could prepare students for our localized version of EMI. Now, this involved English for academic purposes, which was focused not just on general needs like EGAP, as we get from Jordan, but for ESAP, English for specific academic purposes, particularly the needs of our EMI faculty. Now, to make this ESAP, English for Specific Academic Purposes program, we spoke to the content specialists, we got materials from them, advice from them, how they wanted to teach their EMI classes so we could help prepare our students for them. And this led us to the adoption of a CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning approach. Now, CLIL is well researched nowadays, as you've probably heard, but it's got a diversity of methodologies. It's not just one methodology, it's very adaptive. It could be broadly referred to as CBI in America, content-based instruction, or in Europe, nowadays they're calling it at the tertiary level, integrating content and language in higher education. But for the purpose of today, well, let's call it CLIL. It's a simple kind of expression. Now, to explain then how CLIL can be carried out in lessons, there's a continuum here by Met, and it's really quite useful to look at. It shows that there's a dual focus on content and language. On the far right is what we see soft CLIL. That's like a language lesson in which there's just a little amount of materials or content from students' content courses. Such lessons are mostly concentrated on language, like with a little bit of reading from their content classes, but it's a language class. If you move across to the middle and to the left, you'll see more and more content being integrated into that CLIL lesson until finally it becomes hard CLIL, which is just like EMI itself. It's just a lesson which is complete focus on content. the teacher will not care so much about bringing the attention of the students to language. So there's a continuum here. And as Goodman said in her research, you can in one lesson be quite fluid. You can move up and down. I'll explain that a little bit later. One thing is important when we're talking about EAP, which adopt a CLIL approach, is how is it positioned on the curriculum? What curriculum? Well, first of all, we've got to think that ESAP, English for Specific Academic Purposes, is on the language curriculum. Yeah. Now, here we can see that we've got on the left ELT, English Language Teaching, which is pure language. It's just a pure language class with no particular focus on anybody's special content. It's language. CLIL, in the middle, is what we're trying to do at our university, where we're taking the language class and focusing it on the content needs of the students. And then there's kind of like a line here. I should draw a dotted line. This is on the language curriculum, but this then takes the jump over to the EMI. That's the content curriculum, right? So CLIL then is acting as a kind of bridge, and there's different considerations that you could think about here. You see, ELT, language classes, are very much student-centered. EMI on the right is often very teacher-centered, like typical traditional lectures here in Japan. CLIL has to kind of think, well, which way is it going to go? Teacher or student-centered? ELT is language in focus. EMI is very little language in focus. So CLIL combines content and language. The CLIL class tries to prepare the students for the reality of EMI. So all the skills and strategies for EMI are put in there. But in ELT, they're a lot more just language learning strategies. Yeah. Now, when you think about an ELT syllabus, a typical language class, the syllabus is often made within the language teachers themselves. It's intradisciplinary. CLIL, though, that encourages the language teacher to meet the content teacher and to combine their content with language needs, so content and language. So it's very much interdisciplinary in focus. There's a communication there with the content teacher. It's not always smooth, but it needs to take place. And finally, I'd just like to mention L1. What is the role of the L1? In my case, in Japan, it's Japanese. So what role does it play? In some ELT classes, the teacher says, no, we don't want Japanese here. It's only English. And CLIL, well, remember that our teachers said they wanted to develop a bilingual literacy, right? A biliteracy, so to speak. So should Japanese L1 be integrated into CLIL? Let's move on. And let's just show you how it can be done. And I want to give you a few practical examples today, just quickly. I teach a lecture class to prepare my students for the demands of EMI in my own university. And I spoke to a lot of content teachers and said, well, look, how can I help my students better prepare for your future classes and content? And I got a lot of ideas and materials, and I decided, well, look, I can't do everything in one lesson. What I need to do is help my students before the lesson. So what I do is I send them audio files and even some materials in Japanese to stimulate their knowledge of the subject, and so that they can prepare for the lesson in advance. When the lesson actually takes place, at the beginning of the lesson, I have to focus upon the language that I'm going to talk about. In this case, it was something about health, which they're going to be studying in the content classes. So I did lots of vocabulary, pre-listening vocabulary instruction. In the class itself, which was about an NGO, a Japanese NGO active in Cambodia, I showed lots of pictures, lots of visuals, lots of graphs to kind of clarify the content. But I also focused during the class on my lecture input on certain language points. In this case, the idea of a problem. So it's a little bit small here, but the idea of posing a problem, causing a problem, etc. So there was some focus on form during the content instruction there. And then afterwards, homework then required them to write about the content of that class using the language which we had given them. Now, that's all the theory, isn't it? You know, but what did the students think about it? So we asked them over several years, and we got quite a lot of feedback. And here, if you look at some of the content, the comments by students, it showed that they kind of thought it was pretty relevant. I feel the knowledge on which our international relations course is based, and which we must think about, was taught to us in the lecture course. So they saw some relevance. They said it would be useful in other reports. We can think more deeply. And as we gave them some Japanese reading to do in preparation for their class, they thought, well, you know, actually that was useful. Translating Japanese into English was useful for them. Learning international issues from a Japanese perspective was important as well. So we just didn't give them English language related materials to read to support the class. We gave them Japanese language related things, and they helped them stimulate their local knowledge, let's say. Here's an example of what it looks like, the kind of processes they went through. They had to keep a good file in neat order and write a final report. But that's the theory and some practice, which looks good, but there are some problems with CLIL and we can't ignore them. You see, many teachers who asked to teach CLIL say, well, look, am I teaching EFL, an English class, or am I teaching content? And when teachers and some students start to feel a little uncomfortable with this dual focus on language and content, it's called disjuncture, or what Lemert calls shadow structures, because a teacher has English language teacher training and then is suddenly asked to teach content, and there's a discomfort there. And how do they actually do it? So they have to communicate with the content teacher to get that knowledge, and that can be sometimes problematic. Student understanding is also a key point here. Do the students really understand that this is a content and language integrated class? You've got to make those objectives very clear. Now, assessment is also a key point here. In a normal English class, you assess them according to their English language proficiency, right? But when it's a CLIL class preparing for EMI, how about their content knowledge? Are we assessing that? And do the students understand how they're being assessed? Now, remember, here in Japan, we have a lot of low proficiency English learners. So all English, a monolingual English approach, is very challenging for many university students. So if you create chances for them to use their L1 Japanese, it can be kind of like a comfort zone for them. There are benefits though. And I'd like to stress the benefits as well, because I kind of believe in the approach. You see, there are said to be cognitive benefits. If you study the CLIL, then it's said to focus students a little bit more than a normal language class. There are cognitive benefits. It's relevant for students. If you bring in content from their content classes into the language class, they feel, oh, suddenly the language class becomes more relevant. The question, though, remains about authenticity. If you give them authentic reading, like a chapter from a book written in English, it's really tough. So should we be giving them authentic materials, or should we be simplifying those materials and scaffolding it towards the student's comprehension? That's a big question. Also, finally, I think it's interesting that the language teacher working with the content teacher can sometimes be successful, and you can share pedagogies. Yeah, that's a cross-fertilization of skills. The final point here then needs to look at the idea of translanguaging, the L1 use in L2 instruction. Now, traditionally people, said, no, there should be no Japanese in the English class, and a lot of teachers and students still believe that. We've got to really think about the effectiveness of using the L1. And as time is a little bit short, I'll skip a little bit and show how it can be done here. This is translanguaging the L1 Japanese and L2 English use in planning. Now, the final product is in English, all right? But The process of writing an academic paper or preparing for an academic presentation can integrate the L1 quite successfully, as we see here, where you see Japanese and English being used in a mind map. My conclusions then are that I think CLIL used in EAP has quite a lot of possibilities in terms of its authenticity and its motivating ability for students. You can shift from hard to CLIL in a lesson, from language to content focuses. The process of teaching CLIL involves, I think, pre and post lesson support. So you've got to scaffold it a lot, especially for the lower proficiency learners. L1 use is pretty important. It can help bilingual literacy, and our content teachers actually requested that. And there can be a lot of cognitive benefits. However, finally, there are challenges. It's not a perfect approach for many people, teachers and students. Interdisciplinary cooperation for EAP courses when you're building the syllabus can be quite difficult. The content teacher may not want to give you so much support. Teachers and students have a kind of disjuncture. They're uncomfortable because the traditional English language class is suddenly shifted towards a content focus. There are shadow structures. That means that the teacher especially has kind of a language teacher identity, and they're suddenly asked to teach content as well. That kind of is a little bit problematic for them. And how are you assessing students? By language or by content? I'll stop the share now, and if there are any questions in the chat or anything from the moderator, I'm very happy to field those questions.
Thank you so much, Prof. John Adamson from University of Niigata Prefecture, Japan. Let's look in the chat box. Are there questions for the speaker? Do you have a question in the chat box? All right, so Prof. John, there's one question.
Yep.
Well, from Adiba, Farah Adiba, what's the difference between English for academic purposes and English in general?
So the general, yeah, I think one of my slides showed that there was an ELT box, and then the CLIL box, and then the EMI box. The general English was the ELT side, where the syllabus is fundamentally made by the English teacher, focusing on language. The English for academic purposes should be, if you adopt a CLIL and English for specific academic purposes approach, be reaching out to content in terms of materials and methods and forms of assessment and bringing them into your class so that you can better prepare your students for the needs of that future EMI class. And I think that's the difference. General English classes sometimes don't have a future purpose for content.
Right. Okay, so I think that's clear. Thank you so much for the clarification, yep. Prof. John. Are there more questions in the chat box? Or you might want to direct your questions verbally, all right, to the speaker. Yeah, why not? So you have been in Japan for like how many years? I'm sure that you're very good.
For a long time now. for about 28 years now. So yeah.
Wow, almost 30 years. My God. And you speak Japanese too?
Well, I do my best. I do my best. Yeah. I try to translanguage.
I'm sure that, you know, being like almost 30 years in Japan, you are so well versed with the teaching techniques, you know, and yeah, I've involved in this what we call as COIL project, communication online, international learning. So it's quite challenging. Yeah, it's quite challenging to have these Japanese students. You talk about their proficiency in English as well. But I'm sure being there for almost like 30 years, so many things. You know, you have, yeah, that you have captured, right, in teaching them. So
Right.
I'm sure the one that you have shared just now is very, very meaningful for us. Yeah. What more? Same goes to Malaysians too. I mean, we do face challenges in teaching English as well. All right. So are there more questions in the chat box? Yeah, I don't see. Okay. All right. Not yet. It's okay, Prof. John. Thank you so much for your sharing today. Yeah, there's one.
I'll put my email in there. So if you want to email me any questions, please go ahead.
All right.
There we
okay.
go.
Okay, that's great. But is it okay to answer this last question for you?
Yeah, sure.
What do you think about the future of English teacher related to upgrading their skills in technology? As people can learn English without teachers, all right.
About technology. Oh,
Okay, basically it means that to learn English, there's no need to have teachers or facilitators, you know, because they can actually learn the language through the technology. I mean, there's so many platforms that provide information on English language. So what do you think about the future of English teachers?
I think there's always going to be a role for the traditional teacher, but maybe it has to shift towards a teacher who facilitates online learning, right, facilitates autonomous modes. And I think in the keynote speech today alluded to this idea of the teacher being very flexible, fluid, and adopting hybrid modes of delivery. And sometimes those modes of delivery are very different from the traditional. Yeah, and they have to facilitate collaborative modes of learning. And I think that was one of the main points of the keynote today, which I was listening to very carefully. And I think that maybe is a way to answer that question. The keynote today points to the answer there, I think.
All right. Okay, that's great. So thank you so much, Prof. John Adamson. I can see there's one question there, but you might want to answer that through chat. All right, there's one question from Kaironisa in the chat box. All right, I think that's about time that we have for today for this session, English for Academic Purposes, Current Trends, presented or shared by Prof. John Adamson for University of Niigata Prefecture, Japan. Thank you so much, Prof, for spending your time. All right.
Goodbye now.
Goodbye.